Joan Brown was one of the most interesting, accomplished, and independent painters of her generation. She started out painting with the Bay Area figurative artists, was very interested in many similar things, and completely went in her own direction. She set the stage for a lot of the work that particularly women artists were interested in afterwards, and she did it always in her own way. The San Jose Museum of Art has always been interested in Bay Area art history. Besides everything else we do, it's a long standing commitment to the art of the Bay Area, and particularly to the artists of Joan Brown's generation. It's been over a decade since her work has been seen in any detail, and as we were talking on the staff, and Jody Throckmorton, the curator of the exhibition, and I were talking, it was clear that she had been left out of all of the recent surveys and reevaluations of the pioneering work that women artists had done in the 60s and 70s, and we felt that it was high time to reconsider her work in that context. I think one of the most fascinating things about Brown's work is that she always painted what she called the stuff and things around her. She loved representational work. She went back and forth from it. She worked in her home with her regular daily domestic life going on around her, with her child, Noel, running around in the midst of her home, and that became her subject matter. So I'm not sure you can separate out her life as a painter from her life as a mother, her life as a wife, and her family life, which was very important to her. I think we have the tendency to categorize and pigeonhole art history. Joan Brown was a very independent person. She was a very private person. Her work doesn't fit into any neat categories. The fact that she started as an abstract expressionist and a gestural painter and ended up painting very flat quasi-narrative paintings, I think throws many people for a loop. I think that in many of the recent surveys of women's art and women's art history, they focused on the very pivotal leaders of the movement, the women who were joiners. Joan Brown wasn't a joiner, and she didn't want her work to be typecast as work by a women artist, because the women's movement was marginalized for many years, until actually really quite recently. She had had great success as a young artist in New York and played with the boys, as one of her old gallery dealers, her first gallery dealers, had said to us when we started talking about the show. He said, Joan was a swagger chick. Why are you thinking about her in terms of feminism? So she held herself apart. Also, so much feminist work of the 60s in particular was highly confessional. Joan Brown's work is very intensely personal, but it is not intensely revealing. And so in many ways, she was a precursor and a pioneer of many things stylistically that came out of the women's movement: an interest in autobiography, an interest in domestic subject matter, an interest in flat painting and decoration, reviving all of these kinds of things. But she was not necessarily a joiner. And I think at this time, when we have artists working in so many different ways and figuring out ways to envelop personal politics and social context, her work carries greater and greater significance. But if you look at the early works in this exhibition in particular, you see that the paint is on the surface so thickly. She loved the visceral material of paint. She loved pushing paint around. Sometimes it barely comes together in a representational image, and you work to see the image within this amazingly rich, thick texture of paint, which she clearly loved as she was taking her energy and merging it with the kind of energetic style of abstract expressionism. As you see her move on, she introduces more and more intense color into the work. She sometimes introduces such a broad net of pattern and decoration that the figures or the objects get lost in that. And gradually the painting gets thinner and thinner and thinner as she becomes more and more confident and more sure of the subject matter she's putting out there. Not that she wasn't confident before, but the work becomes very much more about the image and the relationship relationship between the various components that make up a composition, which get extraordinarily complex. And the energy comes from a different kind of tension, not so much the tension of the material sitting on the surface, but a tension of the images and how they speak to each other and how they add up, both as a subject, sometimes as a narrative, sometimes as a hint of a narrative, and what that tells you. I think it's really her incredible ability to push into a realm of totally exuberant and sometimes unchecked color, and the use of color that distinguishes a lot of her work. If you look at some of the work from the 60s and 70s, this was a very gray period in art history. It was the heyday of minimalism and conceptualism, if you're thinking of mainstream, critical kinds of movements. And here she is painting bright yellow and red and blue. I mean, she certainly had her own path. Many critics speculate that because she died so prematurely and so young at the age of 52, that it was never really possible to have any kind of summary sense of her career. So although she had great success at a very young age, she always had strong gallery representation, she had a strong teaching career, it wasn't easy to fit her in to any categories or any place in history, because she died at a stage where most artists are actually entering the mature phase of their career. That might have something to do with the fact that we don't feel that she's as broadly known as she should be, given her accomplishments. Her work has certainly been appreciated within the regional understanding of Bay Area figurative art and abstraction. That still remains somewhat separate from the, if you will, mainstream narrative of American art history of that era. But I think that, what you're verging on is a bigger question that's maybe outside the scope of this, which is, why is it that Bay Area art has remained somewhat regionally circumscribed or provincial, if you will, and certain of those artists have been incorporated into a bigger narrative of 20th century art, and others have remained on the sides. And I don't think it's just true of Joan Brown, I think it's true of many other artists. So I think that's a much bigger question than just a question about her work, and one that I think is so sensitive, I'm not sure I want to talk about it. I feel like it's time for the light to shine on the work again. It's time for it to have a showcase, which is what this exhibition is. I think if you're talking about her work in the context of Bay Area art audiences, she's extraordinarily beloved. But it's always interesting to me that even in going to collections in Southern California or in other museums across the country that collect a significant amount of figurative work or collect this period of work, you rarely see her paintings on the wall. Even though she has work in the Museum of Modern Art and many, many other prestigious collections. So we think it's very much time to bring attention to her work, to start a new dialogue about her work. As I'm sure you've heard, Joan didn't associate herself with the women's movement or with feminist art at the beginning. That doesn't mean that she didn't fully believe she could do anything she wanted to as a painter. She didn't want to be typecast as a women's painter or as a woman painter. And this was, you're talking about the 1960s and 70s. That's not at all unusual. There is a certain amount of marginalization of the women's movement and of women's art. I remember talking to artists of my generation, even as recently as 10 years ago, particularly sculptors, who would jokingly say to me, in the 70s and through the 80s, all I ever wore were Doc Martens and jeans, because you wouldn't be taken seriously as a woman artist if you dared to wear a dress. And so now all I wear is dresses. And I remember a sculptor telling me this and just thinking, that's not very long ago, that's not even a generation ago. So imagine Joan's feelings and Joan's position. And she worked and lived and trafficked very fluidly in a coterie of primarily male artists. That doesn't mean, however, that she didn't have a strong sensibility in her work that is very much related to her being a woman, related to her domestic life, and moving into areas that you didn't often see certainly in abstract expressionism. I can't think of another gestural or figurative painter that painted a dog in a dog bed or their son's first Christmas, almost unheard of. I thought it was very interesting when I went back and read Brenda Richardson's foreword to the beautiful monograph on Joan Brown's work that the Oakland Museum did about 11 or 12 years ago. And Brenda recounts a story of Joan Brown and a colleague taking legal action against a San Francisco rowing club that was a men's-only club and wouldn't admit women. And she was determined to change that. So I think, although she wasn't part of the mainstream women's movement, her work was reproduced in women's art periodicals. She certainly was a pioneer, and later in her life she acknowledged the importance and her role in that. Brown talks extensively about trusting her intuition, about not knowing where her painting was going to go, and that's what was interesting to her. I think if you look at different stages of her work, there are different things that were pivotal to her, whether it be her family life, whether it be her later interest in spirituality, whether it be her lifelong interest in Egyptian culture and history. I think it moved around. It's part of the vitality of her painting process and part of her dynamic as an artist that it shifted. I think it's really important when you're looking at her work to look very closely and carefully, to let your eye move around a painting. It's easy to look at something, and especially something that's graphic or diagrammatic, and think you're capturing it all at once. But with prolonged viewing, her work keeps giving other details and other levels of content back to you. And so I think it's that sustained looking that really opens a viewer's eyes to the richness of the painting.